So I think it's about time to talk about a certain movie and specifically a certain dress in this movie here on this channel. It's kind of a dress that started my business. It is the live-action 2015 Cinderella. So we're not just gonna talk about this movie and this specific costume in the movie, but we're actually gonna make it, or more like I'm gonna make it and share the process here with all of you on this channel. And the specific dress that I'm talking about is the stunning, beautiful blue ball gown worn by Lily James in the dance scene with Prince Kit. And really that dress is everything. So we're going to talk about that ball gown in this video, but we're not going to make it in this video because it is a very lengthy process and it will be spread out over many different videos. So in this beginning video, we're going to explore all the fabulous details of this dress and kind of treat it like a costume study. I felt like this would be a good way to explain all the little details and really just all the details of this dress, because there are so many interesting details. There is a lot of information about the ball gown that I have discovered over the past 5 years. When it first was released in 2015, I went and saw it with my sisters, and I kind of fell in love with it when I first saw it and have watched it many times since then. I went home from the theater and pretty much decided right away to make a replica. So in the past 5 years, I have made 5 replicas of the ball gown. But actually, it was only really in 2 years that I made those 5 Cinderella replicas. And no, they are not just sitting around in my closet or something because they didn't work out. They are all over the world. I made the 5 replicas for customers. One went to Europe, and one in Texas, one up in Michigan, I think. They're just kind of all over the place. But with each one that I made, I spent more and more time analyzing the details of the dress, collecting more pictures, more information, more quotes, and more techniques that really help achieve the perfect replica. And so with my 5th one, I unlocked some ideas and techniques that really, it was such an exciting dress to make and to see finished, because I felt like it was almost perfect. Not quite, but almost there. So now that I'm making a 6th one, I am kind of going down memory lane and I'm taking you all along with me. And in this video, I'm just going to share all about the details that I have discovered after hours and hours and hours of poring over pictures of this dress. Literally, I don't even know how to describe how many hours I have sat at a computer staring at pictures of this dress. But it is all worth it, and I have compiled a little PDF of all the information consolidated together, and you can find that on my website. I am charging $5 for it, but I'm just charging that to compensate for the time that it took to compile it and to arrange all the facts in an orderly manner. So the link will be down in the description and should pop up. So as we are about to dive into the details of this dress, one thing that I could probably say is we have plenty, if not too many, pictures of this dress. But because of how much I love this dress and any pictures I can find of it, there's not too many pictures. Or really, I could do with some more. But for the purpose of replicating this dress and looking at the details, we do have a good amount of pictures that I just love pretty much every one of them. So with any project, the first thing to do is find the actual facts of the costume. So when I say this, it means the actual words from the costume designer that they said they did on the costume. These are the facts, you know them. It's not looking at a picture and thinking, oh, I think it's that fabric, or oh, it looks like the bodice was constructed this way, or whatever. You want to first start with, what did the people who actually worked on the dress say they did with the dress? And so mainly these are quotes from the costume designer or the design team. So when you look at the costume, you can have that foundation of those facts that you learned from the costume designer. It helps put little pieces together that you might see in pictures and such. So I've compiled some quotes from the costume designer Sandy Powell, who is absolutely a legend and did an incredible job designing these costumes for Cinderella. Cinderella's dress boasts countless layers of tulle on the petticoat and no less than 4 miles of thread. It's a clever construction, Powell revealed. The whole thing is built over a crinoline cage, which is very lightweight and beautifully made, so that it doesn't actually have that much weight to it. All the layers of the fabric are light too, but built on top of each other, which creates the volume. I wanted to make the gown look enormous. She says the gown had to look lovely when she dances and runs away from the ball. I wanted her to look like she's floating, like a watercolor painting. To convey a weightless flowing dress, the voluminous skirt was composed of more than a dozen layers of fabric that included crepe-lined silk, printed polyester, iridescent nylon in different shades of blue and turquoise. Underneath those layers, James wore a corset and a petticoat. In the end, 9 versions of the Cinderella ball gown were created, each featuring more than 270 yards of fabric and 10,000 Swarovski crystals. It took 18 tailors and 500 hours to complete per dress. So that's good information. One thing I do want to mention, everywhere else that they talk about how many versions of the dress they made, they say 8. I have watched videos of Sandy herself say
there were 8 different versions of it.
So I'm pretty sure it's 8, and maybe they just misprinted it, or maybe there was 9. I don't know. Here's some more information. The top layer is a silk crepe in cornflower blue. The underlayers are made from a synthetic polyester called Umishima. I don't know how to pronounce that, but this is how it's spelled. It is the finest fabric, and it moves like smoke or ink in water. I wanted the top layers to have iridescence, so it's covered in about 10,000 tiny Swarovski crystals. There are 3 different layers of colors, a lilac, a greeny blue, and cornflower. Those layers all sort of flow independently of each other, which gives the dress that movement, and also with the color kind of moving around, that watercolor effect. Of course, it's made beautifully, but it's a feat of structural engineering, getting the weight and the balance of the corset and the crinoline just right. You don't want to get bored with one shade of blue, Powell explains. The overriding color on the top layer is cornflower blue, but then there's other blues and greens and lilacs all mixed together, and they move around each other for a final effect, which is like a watercolor. So those are ones that I found in specific articles about the dress. I also have compiled a little list over the past years of just little tidbits of information that I discovered over the internet, and so here's that list. There's a crinoline over a wire cage, which gives the silhouette. Over the top of that, there's a couple of petticoats with lots and lots of frills, and there are some frills on the inside of the crinoline as well. For the layers over the top, there's only about 5 or 6 layers of very light, fine fabric. The very top layer is a silk. It's called silk crepeline, which is a little bit heavier than chiffon. The base layer was a very cheap fabric of an iridescent pale white color that we sort of put a bit of blue through, and one that the light really bounces off of. A few years ago, someone sent me this really interesting article that she found, and I was so grateful for her to send it to me, and here's the information that Sandy shares in this one. There are 3 miles of thread in the hems, 250 meters of fabric, which is about 270 yards, 400 hours to make the 8 dresses, 10,000 Swarovski crystals, 20 minutes to get the dress on, and one dress was shortened 4 inches for the running scene. The crinoline had 2 secret handles so Lily could lift all the skirts at once. The petticoat had flounced frills at the hem, with a second 3-layered organza petticoat placed over the top. The top layer of the gown is silk crepeline, a very lightweight fine silk. The layers underneath are made up of a synthetic called Umishima, again that word that I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing right, and incredibly light and very expensive, about 150 pounds a meter. Material which floats when thrown in the air. The detachable Bertha, which topped the fairy tale gown, was decorated with dozens of hand-painted butterflies made by Hiroshima artist Haruka Miyamoto. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. I'm not sure. Now, in the same article, Sandy Powell apparently writes it herself, and this is some of the things she says. I wanted the dress to look as light as air, a watercolor in motion. Costume maker Jane Law and I achieved that with the choice of fabric and by using many different shades of shimmering blue. Behind the many layers, the gown is a feat of structural engineering. We started with the underwear, the corset, and the crinoline skirt cage, which was made of steel. Each of the 8 versions of the gown is also slightly different. One was 2 inches shorter, and a couple were 4 inches for the times when Lily had to run. Another had holes cut in the sides for the skirt for harness work. The hems got incredibly dirty as the shoot went on. They proved a headache. These dresses aren't something you can just throw in the wash. So let's just take a time to look at the incredible photos in this article. This photo of the hoop skirt, or the crinoline, is so helpful. And of course, there's also this picture of Richard and Lily. She's in her work dress, but it's all white, so either it's a mock-up or maybe they dyed the whole thing after it was made. Who knows? So this picture of the petticoat and the flounces is literally to die for. It's just so incredible. I love the look of the fabric and the whole team gathered around stitching all the pieces together. And then I also really like the fact that everything in the background is kind of just crammed together, and it's not like this huge professional studio where it was made. So anyway. Also, this main photo is obviously not the same bodice as the one seen in the movie. The butterfly placement is quite different, and the bodice even seems to be a bit different. Plus, there's piping along those front seams, which isn't there in the original dress. So really, all those pictures in that article are there's that behind the scenes pictures that I so wish we could get more of in all the movies, but you know, secrets, I guess. And before we go on to exploring more details more substantially instead of it's a watercolor effect, here's one final quote from Sandy Powell that again just sums up the real beauty and feel of the dress. She needed to stand out of the crowd, but remain simple and pure, like her. It also needed to be big, yet light as a feather, and move because she dances in it. It also had to look fabulous when she runs away. I wanted it chasing behind her as opposed to dragged along. I like that quote. So with those foundational facts put out there, we can now go on to exploring individual details of the various aspects of the dress. So the first thing about any costume, and Sandy Powell says it herself, is to first figure out the understructure of the dress. So let's first talk about the corset. We do know she wears one. Sandy and Lily talk about this quite a few times, and really the whole cast of the movie were put in corsets because Sandy Powell was going for a 19th century feel, not specifically nailed down to that era, but that was the feel that she was going for, and so she put everyone in corsets. So the corset is a topic of controversy because Lily's waist is very tiny. And yes, this is due to a corset, and Sandy Powell talks about this quite a lot. But there's another point that always needs to be brought up, and it's the hourglass illusion. The larger the top and the larger the bottom, the smaller the inside looks. So it's an illusion, that hourglass of the larger top and the larger bottom. And when you see Cinderella's ball gown on screen, your mind doesn't automatically think, oh, that's a huge skirt and that's huge poofy Bertha, and therefore her waist isn't as tiny as it appears to be. Our mind automatically thinks, oh, the most obvious thing that we see is the tiny waist. And yes, it is tiny, but you have to think about our minds don't really comprehend how huge the skirt is. It is incredibly large. We do not see this large hoop skirt, large full ball gowns in life pretty much ever. I mean, even just a basic 1860s dress, the hoop skirt isn't even that large. So our minds maybe goes to that size and therefore think her waist is that tiny. The combination of that large skirt that we really can't comprehend And then the Bertha, which is this part, by the way, makes her shoulders look much larger than they actually are. Which, by the way, this is the illusion that folks in the 1860s took advantage of with their wider, droopier shoulders and their large bell-shaped skirts, because they knew that this made their waist appear tinier than it actually was. So yes, Cinderella does have a tiny waist, but we need to remember that there is illusion working in this mixture. So yes, she has a tiny waist, but it's not an awful, killing, can't breathe type of waist. There's illusion in the picture, and so the larger the skirt and the larger the shoulders, the smaller the waist will be. Now that we've got that aside, we can go on to talking about the corset. So we actually never see the corset that the Lily James wears in the film, but we do see some pictures that Lily James's dance double, Flick Swan, took and posted on her Instagram. And here we see her wearing a corset. So based on these photos, if we assume that a similar corset was worn by Lily James in the actual ball gown, then we can see the basic shape of the corset. You can see an interesting detail of this corset is this low back here, and then this weird V shape that kind of makes it even lower in the back. I'm really not sure what's going on there, but we do get a good idea of the shape of the corset that was presumably worn in the movie. And then in this photo, the corset almost looks shiny, kind of has a shimmer to it, so it's possibly made out of satin or something like that. So the next part of the understructure is the crinoline, or hoop skirt, or skirt cage, whichever you want to call it, but it's mentioned several times in the quotes by Sandy Powell. She mentions that it's steel, and we know that she said it's lightweight and it's structured well to support the skirts. And before I found this article, we didn't really know what it looks like. But then this article came along and we have this wonderful picture of the hoop skirt. I've actually made 2 replicas of this hoop skirt. Each one I got a little bit better at achieving the right shape and keeping it from collapsing with all the weight of the petticoats, which we'll talk about that when I go to replicating the hoop skirt for a 3rd time. But again, we do know that it's made of steel, and based on the picture, you can see the structure of it. One thing to point out is you notice that the back of the hoop skirt is larger and longer than the front. The front is flatter. Another thing we see in this picture is it doesn't look like there's any fabric in between the boning channels. It's presumably all held together by the vertical ribbons, possibly ribbons, coming from the waist down to the bottom and connecting all the different rungs. So with that, we can move on to the petticoat. With the petticoat construction, there's a lot of frills, just a lot of frills. That is the predominant thing of the petticoat with this dress. There's frills, there's a lot of them. And now we need to discuss the details of that petticoat. Fortunately, we have some good pictures of the under parts of the petticoat. This first one is a sheer layer. You can obviously see that. It could be an organza, but if it is, it needs to be a very strong, heavyweight type organza. Trust me, I have tried making a skirt with basic, cheap organza, and it does not hold up the weight. So whatever these layers of the petticoat are made out of, they need to be strong but lightweight. So it needs to be a combination of the two, but one thing for sure, they are holding up a lot of weight of the frills and movement and all that. So whatever these sheer layers are, they need to be strong, and presumably I would guess it's a heavyweight organza. If we look at the front panels of this sheer layer, the bottom of the front gores seem to be smaller and narrower than the back gores. And so this would make sense because the back of the crinoline is larger in the back, and so the petticoat is shaped accordingly. And so that's something to take note of. It's not just a same sized skirt pieces around the whole thing. They presumably were trying to keep the back fuller than the front. Now we don't see this in the picture, but I would assume that there's frills attached to this bottom edge of the sheer layer. In this next photo, we see the addition of some fabric to this layer, and it's a shiny fabric. Presumably it's the iridescent nylon that's used in the skirt, possibly. It's definitely got some shine to it. And the weird thing about the attachment of this piece of fabric along the bottom edge is it almost looks like it's a piece of fabric that they folded in half. So we've got two raw edges on the bottom and a folded edge along the top. What it looks like is it's tacked here and tacked here, and this middle folded edge almost looks like it's just free hanging there. Unless they were then gonna go sew it all down. Who knows when this photo was taken in the construction process, but it kind of just looks like it's that folded edge and it's kind of tacked here, and then around the entire skirt. And that almost gets this V-shaped godette style attachment of this layer. But anyway, that's kind of my theory. It's a rectangle folded in half. We've got this folded edge. It's tacked at various points. The middle is kind of hang loose, so it gives some different movement to the layer as she moves. And then on the two raw edges that are hanging down, we've got the more frills attached. That's my theory. So onto this photo, I do think there's a whole nother layer of a full length layer to the petticoat, because we don't see the crinoline through as sheer as we did in the previous picture. So my guess is it's a whole nother layer, and on that layer there would be presumably frills attached, and then we see the godettes. And then I think I spy a layer under here. You can see it's just darker down there. I think maybe it's another layer. On those two layers, there would be a couple rows of frills attached to each of those. It does look like it's possibly a chiffon fabric, just the way that the fabric looks, but at the same time, chiffon is quite heavy. And with this whole premise of this dress, they wanted a lightweight feel, and with all the fabric that's being added, you want lightweight fabric, because in the end, it is all gonna add up and become a heavy dress. So the lightest fabric possible would really be the best way to go. I have used chiffon on a couple of my petticoats, and to me, it just added too much weight. And so again, I don't think it's probably chiffon. Even though it kind of looks like it, I'm guessing it's not. Maybe it's a voile. So after looking at these layers of the petticoat, we can now go on to that outer full-length layer. One of the quotes mentioned a 3-layered organza petticoat on top. I think this is referring to these full-length layers that you see on the outer part of the petticoat. So that would mean that it's presumably 3 layers. An interesting thing to point out at the waistband of this full-length layer. If we look at the pictures of Flick Swan and zoom up to that waistband area, it almost looks like there's smooth little V's, and then there's a gathered bunch of V-shaped in between those little V's. I almost think this is, again, a godette style skirt. Very small and weird, but it does look like there's little V's, and then just very full V section going all the way down to the bottom, and then another little V, and then another full section. And it's a construction that would be quite unique, but you know, this dress is all about uniqueness. So with frills being attached to every layer of this petticoat, we now need to go on and explore those frills. They are quite disliked by me. They are kind of my nemesis, probably because I've spent way too many hours dealing with them. With 5 Cinderella dresses and the enormous amount of frills I chose to add to each dress, I have spent probably more than 250 hours hemming frills, ruffling frills, attaching them to the petticoat layers, and right now I'm kind of hyperventilating about having to do it all over again. Why did I do this to myself? But really, guys, okay. The full video about making frills for this upcoming dress replica will be plenty of time for me to express my deep frustration and dislike of frills. So I will leave the rest of that to that video that will come. Right now, we're just gonna look at the prettiness of all the frills and not think about the time-consuming aspect of making all those frills. So this is a key characteristic of the dress. We see it when she's dancing and when she's running, and they really are a stunning part of the dress. So it is important to look at them and to look at them in detail. One thing to point out about the frills is they do make up a majority of the volume of that underlayer of the skirt. In a couple of these dancing pictures, you do see the crinoline and the hollow space to the skirt that the crinoline creates, and then we see a very enormous amount of frills poofing out. So it's looks like about 2 feet of poofy frills, and it becomes even larger when she spins and dances. So a lot of frills. But if you look up closely, there's a lot of details to the frills. So I've been calling them frills up to this point in the video. That is personally what I have made my petticoats out of, frills. But because of a quote that I read earlier, they are actually flounces. So first reaction is probably, what's the difference between frills and flounces? So frills are much easier to make, even though making a bunch of them is not easy, but frills are just straight pieces of fabric, hemmed and then gathered up, and that creates a nice volume on the bottom. Flounces are cut curved, basically like a circle. So it's, say you had a large circle and you trimmed off 6 inches off the edge, that would be a flounce. So what you're doing is you're cutting a curved piece of fabric like this. This is the inner part or top part of the flounce. You straighten that flounce out, and what happens is you now have a straight top edge, but then the bottom edge is nice and curly and wavy. Think of a circle skirt, that you get that nice smooth waistline but a nice flowy bottom. So a flounce is taking that idea and turning them into frill-like sections that you can add to things. Flounces are gorgeous. I love flounces. And I didn't know that the dress was made out of flounces when I was making my replicas, but because of how much fabric and time, extra time, it would take to make all those flounces, because now that you have a flounce, you're using more fabric, but also you have this curved edge to now hem. And if you know circle skirts, you know that a curved hem is very hard to do quick. And so my main reason for not doing flounces is time and energy and sanity. So flounces are definitely gorgeous, and you do see them in this petticoat, and you can kind of just tell they're flounces. You have a really nice wavy bottom to all the frilly bits and stuff. And then really, if you look at some of the petticoat pictures, it's not very tightly gathered. And a frill needs to be very tightly gathered to get a really flowy edge. Because again, it's just a straight piece of fabric, and how much you gather the top is gonna depend on how frilly that bottom bit is. Now the crazy thing is, I might, maybe, haven't decided yet, be crazy enough to do flounces on this petticoat for this replica. I might convince myself not to, but I do want to see what it would look like with a bunch of flounces attached to the bottom instead of frills. But we'll find out. So there's a detail about these flounces that is quite unique and is actually part of the process that I really enjoy. It involves fishing line. Yes, you heard me correctly, fishing line. Fishing line sewn into the hem of whatever you want to hem it. You could put fishing line in there, and what it creates is a nice stiff, not stiff, but nice crisp curl to whatever you put it in. So in this case, flounces, you get a nice elegant flow to those flounces by just hemming them, but with the added fishing line in that hem, it really gets this nice crisp curl to them. It's a really unique look. And I did do this with my frills, because you can also do it with a straight edge of fabric. Put that fishing line in, and it does give a nice curl to those frills. So flounces on top of that added fishing line would really get a really nice look to the whole petticoat. So again, I don't know for sure that they used fishing line in their hems of their flounces, but looking at these pictures of the flounces, they definitely have a very crisp, nice curl to the flounces. Based on the material that they said they used in the frills, which tulle is one they mentioned, tulle does not curl like that. It kind of all mushes together. Trust me, I did that with some frills. The tulle kind of just mushes together, and it doesn't keep that curl together. And so added fishing line would definitely achieve this look. Another aspect of the frills to point out is that I believe they were hemmed with a zigzag stitch, which I forgot to mention is actually needed to attach that fishing line to a hem. Use a zigzag stitch, and in the middle of the zigzag stitch, it's securing the fishing line in place. And based on looking at these frills, it looks like the thread used is a metallic thread because you've got some shine to those frills. So now moving on to the fabrics used in these flounces. They do mention tulle in one of the quotes. Personally, I don't think that the flounces are all made up of tulle. It would look much different than it does. And we also see some shiny bits to the frills. I believe this is some iridescent nylon fabric mixed into those frills to get that nice shine. And then I think there's organza and maybe some voile mixed in there to create the different shimmer of the flounces. If you look at those flounces and the petticoat, it has a really neat shimmer and watercolor effect to the dress. And really, I think it's a combination of different fabrics, all hemmed with the zigzag metallic with fishing line in it. So since we've been looking at the movement of the skirt, there's a couple things I want to point out with the under part of the skirt. So if we look under Cinderella's skirt in this picture, we see two interesting points that I haven't brought up and are kind of undergarments. But one of them is this little bit on the hoop skirt. It almost looks like there's some frills inside the crinoline, which actually makes sense because in one of the quotes they mention putting frills on the inside of the crinoline. That's what I think that part is. And then inside we see this kind of slip thing up near her legs. Now, just at first glance, it probably is just like a slip or something, but we actually get a better glimpse of it in this picture. I really don't know what's going on with that little bottom trim edge, but it does look like this is the same thing that we see under her skirt in this lift picture. So with the petticoat and frills aside, we can now go on to the outer part of the skirt. Because of the enormous amount of detail in this ball gown, I've decided to split this video up into two parts. You can find the link for that once it's released down below and it will pop up. The second part of this video will explore the outer skirt, the bodice, and the bertha. Be sure to check that out. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this video was of some use to you all. And a huge thank you to my patrons who have made this project possible. Literally have made it possible. So thank you, patrons, and if you want to learn more about that, you can find the link in the description below. As always, go out into your own sewing area and learn, create, and inspire. And I'll see you next week.